All right, so for this section of the mock test, we're going to go through questions 4, 5, 6, and 7. On one of the papers that someone asked, they said multiplying negative fractions. Just remember that when we're multiplying, regardless if it's integers or fractions, the rules for the negatives are the same regardless. It's just different if we're multiplying fractions or not. All right, but when we're multiplying, remember we said that we can think of the negative as an opposite. So we're doing two opposites here, which means they're going to cancel each other out. And a negative times a negative is going to give us a positive, because remember we talked about it as in sentences. I don't got no money. Also is saying I don't have no money. It's saying that we do have money. So the negatives are going to cancel each other out. And from here, when we multiply, we can multiply our numerators with our numerators and our denominators with our denominators. Now you can multiply it first, or like I suggested, you look to simplify first. So we're going to go ahead and not actually multiply, but write them under one fraction. And then I'm going to just highlight one of my factors in my numerator and say, okay, is there any numbers in my denominators that I can reduce with? Well, 4 and 5 don't, that it can simplify with. 4 and 5 don't have any common factors, so no. But 4 and 8, they're both divisible by 4. So 4 divided by 4 is 1, and 8 divided by 4 is 2. And now I'm going to go ahead and move on to the other number, 15. Now, can 15 simplify with any of my numbers? Well, 5, yes. 5 goes into 15 3 times, and 5 goes into 5 once. And 3 and 2 can't simplify. So that means that when we multiply, it will give me 3 over 2. And we know, since we had a negative times a negative, that that gives me a positive as my answer. So then my answer is a positive 3 over 2. I would say do not get into the habit of writing them as mixed numbers anymore. From pretty much from this point forward, very rarely will we actually use mixed numbers. They're important for you to learn because you can know exactly what this fraction is meaning, that it is 1.5. So it's important for you to understand this number. But when we start getting into higher level maths, very rarely do we actually put them in mixed numbers anymore. We keep them as improper, and it allows us to do our calculations a little bit easier. All right, so for here, the first thing I like to do is look at is figure out what my answer is going to be. Well, a negative times a positive. We know that this is going to end up giving us a negative because we're doing repeated addition, essentially, from here with the negative numbers. So I know my answer is going to be negative, so maybe I'll just write a negative sign really big off to the side and say, hey, that's what my answer is going to be. And then with division, we know that we keep our first one, we change to multiplication, and we flip to multiply by the reciprocal. I'm no longer going to worry about this negative as I do my next steps. But if you want to, just so you don't forget about it, keep it with you the whole time. But once we do this, we're going to write our numbers that we're multiplying in our numerator together, and we're going to write the numbers that we're multiplying in our denominators together. Now, you can multiply them if you want. But like I said, I think it's easier to simplify with smaller factors than with larger. So I look at 3 and say, can 3 have any factors that are common with 8 or 9? Yes. 3 and 9 both share a common factor 3, so I can divide each of these by 3 to get 1 and 3. And now 16, does it share a common factor with 3 or 8? Yes, it does with 8. 8 goes into 8 once, and 8 goes into 16 twice. And now we can just go ahead and multiply across. So we knew the answer is going to be negative, so it's going to be a negative 2 over 3, and that is your final answer. All right, so for this problem, we see we're multiplying a bunch of different numbers together, and we have 3 negatives here. So one of the things that I just want to go over is it was Evelyn and Maya, I believe, that came up with this for the opposites, that if we had for every two opposites, they cancel each other out. So an even number of opposites, we knew that the number was going to be the original number that we had, and an odd number was going to change the number that we had. So from here, if we think about if we're multiplying 2 negatives together, we know it's going to be a positive. Well, what happens when we multiply 3 negatives together? Well, we just said that 2 negatives gives us a positive. So it means this 2 is going to be equal to a positive. So we'll have a positive times a negative, which we know is going to give me a negative. Well, then what happens when we have 4 negatives together? Well, when we have 4 negatives together, we know that these 2 will give me positive, and these 2 are going to give me positive. So this is going to end up being a positive times a positive, which we know is also going to be positive. So if we look here, we have an even number of negatives or that we're multiplying, and it gives us a positive. We have an odd number of negatives that we're multiplying, and it gives us negative. Even number of negatives, it gives us a positive. So let's see, well, what will happen then if we have an odd number of negatives? So let's just multiply 5 negatives together. Well, we just said that these 4 negatives give us, let me add one more negative there. This is said that these 4 negatives gives us a positive as our answer because we just solved that in the part before. And a positive times a negative we know is going to give me a negative. So every single time that we have an odd number of negative signs, we know we're going to have one left over, which is going to make the number negative in the end. Anytime that we have an even number of negatives, all the negatives are going to be grouped into pairs of two, which will eventually turn into positive, and that is going to give us a positive answer. So I look here and see that I have 3 negatives. So that tells me, okay, that this is going to end up being a negative as my final answer. So you can go ahead and do that first just to kind of give yourself, okay, I know my answer is going to be negative, or you can do it at the end. When we're just multiplying, we can rearrange. So I'm going to go ahead and I just like to do and save the smallest number if I'm doing this in my head. Or if I'm writing it out. Regardless, I like to save the smallest number for last, but it's up to you of how you want to do this. You can multiply the first two together and then the last two together, and then multiply those two numbers. It's really up to you. But I like to go my largest to my smallest, so I'm going to rearrange this as -7 times -4 times -3 times -2. And remember, if this had any division in it, you can't rearrange like that. You have to go in order from left to right. But since we're just straight multiplying, we can rearrange. And -7 times -4 is going to give me a positive 28. And now I'm left with times -3 times -2. And now I'm going to do 28 times -3. Well, 20 times 3 is 60. And 3 times 4 is 24. And 60 plus 24 is 84. And we know that a positive times a negative will give me a negative. So it's -84 times -2. And then our last one, whoops, I realized here as I rewrote, this 2 should never have been negative. So let me just go ahead and erase it. So now we have -84 times +2. So we know it's going to give us a negative as an answer. And then 80 times 2 is 160. 4 times 2 is 8. So it's -168. And you see, I made a mistake when I rewrote putting the negatives with the 2's, but I knew my answer at the end because the very beginning of the problem I said had to be negative. And based on the way I wrote it, I was like, oh, wait, this is going to be positive. So where did I make my mistake? So by doing something like this in the beginning of the problem can also help you find any mistakes that you might do as you go along the way. All right, so this problem does have a division in it, so we must go left to right for this one. We can't rearrange anything that we're doing here and until we just have just multiplying left. But we're not going to rearrange. We're just going to go right through. And first thing I'm going to do is look, okay, I have 2 negatives, and when it's an even number of negatives, I know it's going to give me a positive as my answer, so I know my answer is going to be a positive number here. So I'm just going to put it off to the side just to remind myself. So now we're going to go -2 divided by 1/8. So remember, we multiply by its reciprocal, so that becomes actually -2 times 8, which is then going to give me a -16. And now it's being times by 1/4 and being times by -6. So now I'm going to multiply these together. Anytime that we're multiplying by a fraction as 1 over something, it's the same as being divided by it because this 16 is understood to be over 1. And when we multiply across, like we did in the previous problems, we will get 16 times 1 over 1 times 4, which is 16 over 4. So you see, we we are just dividing by 4 in that case whenever it has a 1 in the numerator. And 16 over 4 is going to give me 4, so it's -4 because it was -16. And then we're multiplying it by -6, which is then going to give me a positive 24 as my answer. All right, so that's it for this video.